It replaces the original. How many times have you heard this? Why sift for a skip for a TV that only Stretch Armstrong can hold, and get some dusty cartridge that won't work unless you do as much blowing as a single mum on OnlyFans, when you can boot up your current gaming setup and play a remake that has pretty visuals and ray tracing that you'll no doubt forget about after you've stared at a puddle for 10 minutes. This isn't going to be the kind of video where I tell you that the only way to play a Game Boy game is if you spend hundreds on an original copy for the authentic experience.
Oh boy, I'm so hungry I could eat an Octorok!
Quite frankly, that just sounds miserable. But there is merit in playing a game that has been remade. I'll be primarily talking about remakes, because remasters generally are just the same game in HD with a few quality of life changes. They're essentially enhanced ports. Most of the time. This isn't a teardown of remakes either. I do actually believe that they have a place in the industry. A remake can be paramount to revitalising a franchise. Crash Bandicoot 4, for example, would definitely not exist if the Sane Trilogy wasn't so popular. Sometimes it's a reminder to the developers of what made those franchises great in the first place, after they've strayed far away from what made them so beloved. If you haven't gotten access to a PC where you can sin, or if you only have the latest console, it's still an acceptable way to experience these stories. I'd rather someone play Shadow of the Colossus remake than just not experience Shadow of the Colossus at all. However, I'm going to explain why I think that the original versions of games that have been remade are still worth playing, and in some ways, how they are even better. Artistic intent is a really hard thing to measure, unless you can just sit down with a game developer and ask them why they picked a particular lighting choice in a scene, or why they chose specific game mechanics, and even if you do, sometimes the limitations are what makes some of these happy accidents that are so nostalgic to people. But a remake team might take one look at it and think, well, I can't see very far in front of me, can I? Let's tone that down. Sometimes a change that seems like a no-brainer causes issues. Most people would agree that making every Crash game control the same is for the best. But when you copy over the exact same level design wholesale and make Crash in Crash 1 control like you did in 2 and 3, you get a remake that's harder to execute jumps than the original.
Uh-oh.
Improving gameplay without tweaking other important elements can also just snap a game in two. Metal Gear Solid The Twin Snakes implements a lot of mechanics from Metal Gear Solid 2. Again, on paper, sounds great. Snake is more versatile than ever. However, the level design, AI, and bosses are exactly the same, meaning that the tense duel against Ocelot can be dealt with like this.
In this one, the speedrun strat is to just aim at him and shoot at him. He'll always miss his second shot at you directly, so you don't have to dodge.
Games need to be worth their full price tag, right? We can all agree on that. But if the quality's there, I'd happily pay full price for an 8-hour experience. And as for Final Fantasy VII Remake, there were fears before release that it wouldn't be long enough. Well, I hope you're happy, because Square Enix spreads the cheeks of a 5 or 6 hour long section of the original and makes it 30 plus hours long. Were there cool additions? Of course. But Jesus, the pacing is abysmal. There are hours of my life I wish I got back. Single screens in the original transformed into mindless dungeons that butcher the flow and add nothing to the story. If you want to make Final Fantasy VII multiple parts, that's completely fine. But please knock a tenner off the price tag and knock 10 hours off the runtime. In the original, the filler is just not there. Every hour there is reveal after reveal, battle after battle. I'm not helping some Gmod NPCs with their rat problem because I'm already storming the Shinra building. Unfortunately, this isn't just a Final Fantasy VII problem. Yakuza Kiwami, a remake of a PS2 original, there is a section where you have to get food for a dog. So you get the food, bring it back to the dog, and that is it. In the remake, you go get food, bring it back to the dog, then you have to go get water, bring it back to the dog. Then you're told you need to go get a plate, so you go get a plate and bring it back to the dog. What does this add but unnecessary bloat? The main story is apparently 3.5 hours longer than the original. So why is it longer? Well, they've added cutscenes to further develop one of the main characters, but there are just so many tasks that are just given extra steps for no reason. Not to mention that Majima, a character that you fight twice in the original, now you have to scrap with like 60 times. For what? A few funny interactions that get old very quickly. Now the 3 scenes that he appeared in the original are lost of all dramatics and thematics. There's a weird disconnect between the original stuff that had a lot more serious tone and the new stuff which has the wacky antics that's more in line with the modern games. It creates a contrast that I don't think really works. The look and vibe of the originals, I feel Final Fantasy VII Remake and Resident Evil 2 Remake just nail. But sometimes, a remake couldn't care less about emulating that original tone. What about the Ratchet and Clank remake / reboot / movie tie-in? In the original PS2 game, Ratchet was a bit of a dick. He shot dudes with guns haphazardly bolted together, and he definitely didn't care about anyone but himself.
As soon as I find Quark, I'm selling you for scrap.
It's only when Ratchet bonds with Clank over the course of the game that he finally loses that edge and builds a friendship that will last a lifetime. That Insomniac Games is called a character arc. Now we go to the remake. You've got this plushy looking bitch, but so cute and cuddly. Everything is so shiny and we have jokes that are actually funny like this.
Look, plumber's crack.
What did you just say?
I said, look, the plumber's back.
Replaced with shit like this.
The kids love their social medias. Hashtag Gadgetron.
That's not even the worst of it. Even if I could just switch my brain off and just enjoy the gameplay, I would find it somewhat excusable. But unlike Final Fantasy VII Remake that had too much content, this game has less content than the original. I get game development is tough, but before you add new stuff, at least make sure the stuff from the original is there. Now let's look at some iconic locations and compare them to their remake, shall we? What about the logging site from Ratchet and Clank? Or the clock tower section from Resident Evil 3? Or Sinsaisho from Yakuza 2? You literally had one job. I can make an entire video about Yakuza Kiwami too. They didn't even bother adding reflections to their bloody floors, because instead of putting time towards that, they decided to add stuff like this. Now let's touch on Resident Evil for a second. The remake of 1 and the remake of 2 and 3 are completely different beasts. 1 is a faithful adaptation that improves on everything, apart from the voice acting.
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
You're right.
But it has enough callbacks to the original and subversions that I'd still recommend that you play the PS1 game too. 2 and 3 have often been referred to as reimaginings, as yes, they have the same basic framework for the narrative, but for the most part, they're different games. I adore these remakes, but they do lack the branching story paths, at least to the same degree as the originals, and have a gameplay style that's quite dissimilar. So honestly, there's no reason not to play both. And that's kind of what I'm getting at. Most remakes I enjoy, but I'm not gonna lie, despite the fact that I played the Sane Trilogy first, I still boot up PlayStation 1 versions of Crash 2 and 3 because, well, look at him. He's perfect. There's a certain look to a PlayStation 1 game that's hard to replicate. Everything looks dark and a little grimy. There's an atmosphere to the PS1 titles that remakes struggle to emulate. And let me just squash some obvious criticisms. No doubt there'll be comments calling me nostalgic. Most of these remakes that I have played, I played before I played the originals. So I don't think that that's a fair critique, especially considering the only game I had on my PlayStation 1 was Shrek. Now if there are going to be remakes until the end of time, that's fine, but I have a few caveats. The original Metroid is actual ass, but the remake is bloody brilliant. Said remake also lets you unlock the original as a reward, something the remake of Medieval also does. Please put this in all your games, it's such a good idea, and it's honestly the best of both worlds. The next thing that I require of remakes is if it's in the original, don't cut it. Rework it if you have to, but don't cut it. there's no reason at all why there should be less content in a remake than in the original. Now the next thing I want is probably the hardest thing you can do, which is try to capture the essence of the original. This is hard to accomplish, but if you want to modernise the gameplay and the graphics, try not to water down the stylish visuals or make it fit in with modern day politics. It should reflect the time period of its release without reflecting the technology. Of course, I want your quality of life changes like your auto-saving, button mapping, that sort of thing. But the most important thing of all is if remakes are here to stay, then please game companies, let us access the original too. We all have attachments to games for different reasons, and I think every version of every game should be available, even if it means you have to buy it again. So if you can buy the original on current consoles, do it. If not, get that shit running on your PC, your phone, anywhere. Just make sure you give these games a try, because every remake was only remade because the original was pretty great, and a lot of the time, they still are.